Hello and welcome to this video. Today we're going to be talking about Theodicy by Leibniz. We're going to be talking about his response to the problem of evil, best known as the best possible world theodicy or Leibnizian Optimism, or whatever you want to call this theodicy. We're going to be talking about that in this video, giving you three overviews of the topic. First of all, we're going to be talking about Leibniz's goal. The second thing we're going to be talking about is his theodicy in general. And the third thing we are indeed going to be talking about is the developments of this theodicy. We are going to get right into this and start talking about Leibniz's goal. Now, I think that Leibniz's goal is very interesting because it is quite different from the traditional theodicies that we do indeed observe in the world today in philosophy. Now, of course, there's a comment, well, Leibniz's theodicy is aimed to solve the problem of evil. That is not something to argue about. By nature, theodicies are there to solve the problem of evil. However, at the same time, I think that Leibniz not only is trying to solve or at least kind of question the existence of evil, but he's also trying to provide a comprehensive worldview of how are we meant to structurally view the world given the existence of evil. And in some ways, he's existentially dealing with the question, not only ontologically with the existence of evil. So it is quite an interesting approach, and it is quite helpful when we are indeed trying to understand the problem of evil. A good example of this would be if you're talking about the theodicies in history, right? You have planting of the free will defense. That I'll say is on one far of the side, was just saying, well, let's just look at the problem of evil and just solve it without really developing a worldview based on it. Now, of course, Plantinga does develop this further. However, the traditional free will defense in its most simple form is mainly there just to solve the problem of evil. There's God, the logical problem of evil in Mackey's terms. And then, well, let's find free will to solve this problem. What Leibniz is doing is going beyond that. He's not just trying to solve the problem of evil. He's trying to find a holistic understanding to look at the entirety of the world and say, well, given the existence of the world, what is the best way to look at evil? What's the best way to look at God? And how should we view the world in general? Going back to our previous discussion, there are a few different types of theodicies and a few different aims that these theodicies have. Sometimes in Plantinga, the aim was purely to solve the problem of evil. You go to Irenaeus, you have also some of the soul building theodicy, so you have some reasons for why God will provide it. And then when you have those two sides, I would say, well, let's narrow it down a bit more and say, well, Leibniz finds himself in the middle of those two sides. He's not going all the way there to just say, I'm trying to solve the problem of evil, and that's that. What Leibniz wants to do is go beyond that and say, well, I'm not only trying to solve the problem of evil, I want to go beyond it and also try to understand or explain why there might be evil. But at the same time, he's not going far enough to the side of Irenaeus to say, well, let's figure out what God's exact reasons are for providing evil. And I'm not trying to say Irenaeus tries to do that, or the people who follow that Irenaean soul-making theodicy do that. But rather, we do see two poles, and Leibniz falls into the middle, and this is what he writes about it. And just to let you know, all these quotes I have come from Leibniz's book Theodicy, so all the citations go back to there. He writes, Leibniz's project is not in order to find God's reasons, but to show that he cannot lack such, and that there are no opposing reasons of any validity. And what this means is that Leibniz is not necessarily trying to figure out, okay, there's God, there's evil, why does God allow evil? Rather, he is saying, and this is a different perspective, and that's why when we're thinking about these things, we have to first approach it from the perspective of what are the perspectives and what are the aims of this argument trying to achieve. You cannot judge an argument based on what they're not trying to achieve. You have to base your argument on what they are trying to achieve. So as a result, when we're thinking about what does Leibniz want to achieve with this argument, what he's trying to achieve is the idea that God does have reasons to provide. And if God does have reasons to provide it, and that we have reasons to believe that God has reasons to allow evil, then that is a problem of evil solved, or at least reduced. Because let's think about it, right? If you have evil and God on both sides, we might not need to know exactly what the reasons of God are to allow evil. All we need to do is say, well, God exists, evil exists. Well, given the existence of both these things, it is way more reasonable to suggest that God has his reasons to allow for that evil, even if we don't fully understand those reasons as well. So it's more like saying, let's take a step back first and say, well, yes, we know that God has reasons because, well, we have God, we have evil. We might not know these reasons, but, well, why should we be expected to know these reasons? These reasons are, at the end of the day, we are finite minds. We should not be able to know everything about why God may allow evil to exist, but at least we have an intuitive understanding that God probably has reasons to provide for the evil that exists. So then there is that intuition there as well. And that's kind of his project. So he's not really trying to argue that, oh, this is exactly God's reason, but rather he's arguing, well, God does indeed have a reason. Now, also, the second part of this phrase says that there are no opposing reasons of any validity. There, he is just arguing that, well, yes, we know that God has a reason, and we also need to provide arguments for the why that we need to know that God does not have any reason. So it's like, well, God has reason here. We must respond to every argument, which shows that God does not have a reason. So that would be kind of like the Mackey's logical problem of evil. That would be an opposing reason of any validity, saying there are no reasons at all which would allow God to allow evil. And then that would be an argument that Leibniz would be arguing against. What he would not be arguing against would then be the arguments where, like, well, I'm not really sure whether God has reasons or not, like the more evidential formulations of the problem of evil. Then he would not jump to those evidential problems of evil. Rather, he would just sit back and say, well, that's not really what I'm trying to do right now. That's not really the argument that I am providing. That's not the argument I'm trying to respond to. And that we have to move beyond just trying to respond to all these evidential problems, but rather just to demonstrate that, well, there are no opposing reasons to the argument that God does have reasons for evil. And if you're enjoying this video so far, then make sure you hit that like button. It means a lot to me, and it really helps this channel grow. Now, let's continue on and say, well, one of the other reasons why he's developing this theodicy is not necessarily because he really wants to develop a theodicy. Of course he does, but he also finds that previous theodicies are insufficient. More specifically, that is the Augustinian theodicy of free will. And the Augustinian theodicy of free will isn't just more of the strictly Plantinga's a version of the theodicy of free will, which says there exists free will, rather dependent on the fall, and that it is the fall of man which has cursed all humans for sin afterwards. And listen, this is what Leibniz says about the strangeness of the Augustinian theodicy. He says, it is strange that the sin of another should condemn anyone, but there still remains the question of why God does not deliver all. And this is essentially the argument of saying we have evil and we have God, right? We have these two poles at the same time. In classical Christian theology, what we see is that Adam and Eve ate the fruit, and as a result, humankind was cursed with sin. That's the original fall of man. Now what Leibniz is saying with this quote right here is to say, well, this fall of man, this idea that we are inherently bound to sin, does seem weird, especially if the fact that it is the sin of someone else who leads to moral responsibility blamed on us. And as a result, what Leibniz wants to do is to go beyond this original kind of theodicy, go beyond this original kind of structure of sin, and to develop it even further. So I hope you've enjoyed, or at least understand what Leibniz's goal is so far. And then let's turn to the second part of the discussion, which is Leibniz's theodicy. We'll talk about his theodicy in depth, and I think it is quite interesting. So let's talk about Leibniz's theodicy now that we have indeed understood his goal. Now, Leibniz's theodicy is essentially this, that if God exists and evil exists, the best reason to view it is that we live in the best of all possible worlds, because God would, being the all-powerful being that he is, would create, if he could, the best of all possible worlds. And as a result, the world we live in right now is the best of all possible worlds, despite all the evil, because if there was a better possible world, then God would have known of that better possible world, and then would have created that best of all possible worlds. So when you put those few things together, his response is like, well, yes, there are evil in this world. We might not know exactly why they're evil, but in some ways, with finite human knowledge, we are unable to fully grasp all these concepts together, and then we have to just analyze and understand, well, okay, we have those two massive concepts together. The only solution to these few things is that God created the best of all possible worlds, even if we don't fully understand what the best of all possible worlds is, or why this is the best of all possible worlds. And of course, there is the coming argument of Candida, which is by Voltaire, which is like, oh my gosh, there's so much evil in this world. But then, well, Leibniz would just bite the bullet and say, well, yes, there might be so much evil in the world, but nevertheless, for all we know, this is the best of all possible worlds. And that will be Leibniz's response to Voltaire. Whether you like it or not, find it convincing or not, we need to once again think back to his goals. He's not necessarily trying to show exactly what the reasons are, but rather to show that these two things are consistent. And when you put these two together, there is good reason to believe that given the context of what we're reading, we can indeed see some sort of best of all possible worlds, or we do indeed see some sort of justification for Leibniz's belief in face of Voltaire's argument. But then at the same time, and this turns to our third point, right, which is the development of this theodicy, it does seem quite weird, at least if you're following the traditional conception of God, that when we're talking about theodicies, when we're talking about evil, what we notice is that, well, there still does seem to be a lot of evil in the world which could potentially have been avoided. And of course, Leibniz would then still hold his ground, and I don't think there's necessarily anything logically inconsistent with Leibniz's argument, which makes it very difficult to hold. Though, of course, there's still that intuitive pang of argumentation within it, which still kind of persuades or suggests that we should move away from this just, oh, this is the best of all possible worlds, deal with it kind of thing, to develop it a bit further. And what I think an interesting development it is, and of course, feel free to ask me any questions about this development, is that I think the better development of Leibniz's argument is precisely to say, well, we currently live in a world which has the potential to become the best of all possible worlds. Because of course you have the problem of free will, and of Leibniz has his own response to the problem of free will. I'm not necessarily sure whether it is as convincing as someone would like, because of course God created the best of all possible worlds, including all the contingent affairs, not necessarily caused the contingent affairs necessarily, but rather that the world that we live in is the best of all possible worlds. But of course that then has this intuitive problem of free will. So the response to that would then say, well, what if God just created the potential for us to live in the best of all possible worlds, and we are living in this world which has the potential to be the best of all possible worlds? And then when you look at it from that framework, then you notice that, well, wait a second, actually, it is our responsibility to make this the best of all possible worlds, and the problems that arise is only a result of failures either by mankind or this world, which has moved away from its potential. And that seems to be a reasonable analysis. It first of all solves the problem of God's free will and God's knowledge and our free will, because, well, God has created the potential, knowing that this world has a potential for it to become the best of all possible worlds. And then you could say in the same time, we'll say, well, and also he added fail-safes like Jesus Christ to say, well, if this did not end up as the best of all possible worlds, then it would fall, then I'll send Christ in, and you can say like kind of that counterfactual argument as well. So I think that you can create a structure, and perhaps a stronger structure than Leibniz, by just arguing that instead of this being the best of all possible worlds, this is a world with the potential to become the best possible world. So I think that that is a reasonable development of Leibniz's theodicy, and I think it is a very good way for us to conceptualize Leibniz's theodicy, especially if you want to use it in discussions going forward. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe. It really means a lot to me and really helps the channel grow. I try to respond to every single comment that you put there, so if you have any questions, then make sure you reach out to me. So stay safe, my friends. See you soon. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.